This podcast is part of the Big Heads Media Podcast Network. Go to bigheadsmedia.com for more great podcasts.
While you may think that history is vaguely interesting, the truth is it's fun and metal AF.
Echoes of the past are still reverberating through our world today, and Body Count is here to show you how our shared history affects your life on the daily.
Whether you know it or not. So, are you past the point of higher education?
Feel like you didn't learn anything from your high school history teacher?
Or just didn't give a flying crap about it?
Are you tired of always missing out on the yellow history pie piece in Trivial Pursuit?
Are you the horror of all your friends' game nights?
Did you once proudly announce that Napoleon Bonaparte was a super short little nutsack?
When in reality, he was an average-sized nutsack.
Have you been thinking about living under a faulty dam?
Or perhaps an active volcano?
Well, we have good news. It's not too late for you or your homeowner's insurance.
Come on over and listen to Body Count, the podcast that explores death and disaster through the ages with only one rule.
Someone, or usually a lot of someones, dies.
Because history doesn't repeat itself, it rhymes.
A proud member of the MSE Podcast Network.
This episode of BiCurean, we spoke with Stephen Hawkins, Director of Research from More in Common. From COVID to election integrity, More in Common seeks to understand our divisions and how to bridge them.
Hi, I'm Eric.
And I'm Aisla.
And together we are the hosts of the BiCurean podcast.
BiCurean is our answer to the polarizing culture we live in.
Tired of feeling under siege and looking for ways to get involved? Then come be a part of a different way of thinking.
Everything from politics to geek culture to current events that polarize us as a society, we explore multiple ways of looking at things.
Welcome to the show.
We're excited to be here today with Stephen Hawkins from More in Common, the Director of Research at More in Common.
Thanks
for having me on, guys.
Yeah, please introduce yourself.
Okay, my name is Stephen Hawkins. As Aisla said, I'm the Director of Research for More in Common. More in Common's an international nonprofit. We're based in the United States, the UK, France, and Germany. And we work on problems of societal division and political polarization in those four countries. And my particular role is that I lead all of our public opinion research, which serves to orient the work that we do to try and understand the phenomena that we're concerned about, that are undermining our democracies, that are causing higher levels of concern within our societies. And so we produce research in those four countries, in those four languages, and use that to guide our partners and guide ourselves.
Well, and I'll start out. So I heard about you and your organization on an NPR article several months ago. And my immediate thought was, wow, that's the closest I've ever heard of anybody who's doing something along the lines of what we're doing with the show. One of our main missions is to kind of fight polarization, to get people to actually just be able to talk about things. So it's a pleasure to have you on, just because I feel like we're kindred spirits in a lot of ways. And I'm very excited to get some more data on some of the things that I know Aisla and I have been feeling for a while.
Yeah, concurrently, when that happened, I'd actually found an article called The Perception Gap, which is about the research you did on the ways in which Democrats and Republicans in America view the other side and how different it is from where they actually stand. It was a little bit complicated, but we actually did a show kind of outlining some of those points because we thought it was such a helpful thing for people to be aware of. What got you started in More in Common, or how did More in Common come to be? It seems like a great idea, long needed.
Yeah, I appreciate that. The origin story of More in Common actually begins with tragedy. In the summer of 2016, a member of parliament in the UK, a woman named Jo Cox, who is a champion of bringing refugees into the UK, resettling refugees, especially from Syria in the UK, was killed by one of her constituents. And this man was a white nationalist, and he stabbed and shot her to death in front of her staff right outside her office. It was a horrible moment in the UK and around the world, and was a real red warning, flashing light for a lot of people. And there was an outpouring of support from the public And there was a lot of concern among her friends and among broader civil society in the UK about what this meant, that the level of disagreement in British society had reached a point where elected officials no longer felt safe, felt like they could take their safety for granted. And so with that, More in Common, which actually comes from Jo Cox's maiden speech in Parliament, where she was talking about how her constituents have more in common than what separates them, came into being with an outpouring of public support from the British public, which was used to create a foundation in her name, the Jo Cox Foundation, and to create More in Common, which was designed to try and understand these phenomena. What was going on that was going so far off the rails that lives were being lost? And so I came on as more or less the first hire from More in Common to help study these issues. And so we looked at the UK, at France, at Germany, and we've also done studies in Greece, in Italy, in the Netherlands, and of course in the United States. And we've been doing research since about 2016 to try and understand, especially the psychological dimension of the divisions that we're seeing in those countries.
Again, thank you for the work. I think it's a pretty major issue. And like you said, the tragedy kind of sparked it because it was so upfront. I do recall that story. And I don't know if you've noticed this. You're the facts and data guy, but it feels like it's gotten worse even since 2016.
Yes, it does. And it does vary depending on which country you're in. France is a country of deep pessimism and cynicism towards the political system. Basically, across Europe, we've seen the center-left parties collapse. And in France, we've also seen the Socialist Party basically come to a place of collapse. And the current president is embodying a new kind of centrism, but right on his heels is our right-wing party, which has never held significant power, never held the presidency, certainly, but is within contention. And in Germany, there was the rise of the Alternative for Deutschland party, AfD party, which came to new levels of power, unprecedented levels of power since the reunification of Germany. And so that was a real point of concern in Germany. Germany is now most stable of the four countries that we're looking at. It's done a very good job of managing COVID-19 crisis, but France is not in a great place. The United Kingdom has been racked with division since the Brexit vote, and the United States is in a place of real deep division. So we've been in the United States, which I imagine we should probably focus the most of our conversation on the U.S. We asked people whether the country feels united or divided. And in 2018, right around the time of the Kavanaugh Supreme Court hearings, which is a real low point with the accusations there and the partisan vote, et cetera, we had 82%, I think, of Americans say that the country felt divided. This year, in the spring of 2020, just as COVID was beginning and people were all hunkered down in their houses, everybody was coming together in the sense that we were all kind of in it together. That number dropped down from 80% to still a majority, but in the 50%. It's in the 50% range. And so we saw a real drop in March, April. That was exciting for us because we, in this space of counterpolarization, look for the things that could serve as the mechanisms to draw people back together across the lines of difference and across the identities which are in conflict. And sometimes an external threat can really serve that purpose. Everybody is similarly threatened by COVID-19. And so we thought that within the United States, this could be the driver of a sense of common purpose, which could bring some of the disagreements that we have to the backdrop and bring to the forefront our shared interests, our shared desire to survive and navigate this crisis. And we did see that happen in March and April. And then we had the murder of George Floyd. And subsequent to that moment and the massive flare-up of our country's largest demonstrations in its entire history led right back to a place of division. And so now, at the time of our recording this, end of July of 2020, the division that we're seeing in the United States is right back up at the peak of where it was in 2018. And so we have missed an opportunity to see COVID-19 as the external threat, which could cause us to come together, or at least we've squandered that opportunity.
Mm. So I know my favorite saying, the plural anecdote is not data. So I'm not attempting to assert this. And I will say that one of the interesting things to me around my personal experience with the rise of Black Lives Matter is the number of my conservative friends who have been resistant to really engaging in conversations about racism in our country, who have called me up because I know I'm a safe person to talk to and said, hey, can you explain reparations or why people are upset? Because I feel like I'm missing something. And so I was I was heartened by that, the personal experiences I had of people who were taking on educating themselves, from a person they knew really stood for something that was different from where they came from.
Right. And we have found that, one, the conversation about race is happening all across the country. Your experience is representative. I think we saw about 70% of white Americans actually saying that they had had conversations about race in the previous weeks. And so the conversation is moving to the forefront of people's minds. The challenge is that it's becoming ensnared in a broader conversation about American identity, which is the politicized identity in the era of Trump. And for Donald Trump's political base, American identity is really central. We ask people questions like, kind of unusual and weird questions, but we ask people, how important is American identity? How proud are you to be American? How frequently do you think about the fact that you're American? And for Donald Trump's core base, being American is number one or number two most important to them. If it's not number one, it's only just behind being Christian. Now, for people who are on the progressive side, who are leading the protest movements, being American is of distant importance. It's just not how they conceive of themselves. Many of them don't feel like they particularly belong in the United States. They feel like they're part of more of a kind of global cosmopolitan secular culture. Maybe they feel more connected to Europe. And so we're having these conversations about race, reparations, American history, our American founders, the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow. The risk is that the progressive left speaks in such a way that makes people on the right feel that their identity is being confronted directly. And I think that risk isn't fully seen because it's from the left, it's not equivalent. The place of American identity doesn't sit in the same prized place for people on the left. And so we're in a really difficult, I think we're in a very difficult place as a society where we're trying to navigate two identity conversations simultaneously. One is about race and the experiences of Black Americans in this country. And the other is about American identity and whether American identity should be something which is a badge of pride, as it is for many people, or whether it should be something which needs to be really confronted because of the legacies of injustice which it has carried out against populations that weren't part of the majority for so much of its history.
So that's an interesting thing, and you use the word, but something we've talked about on a couple of shows in various forms is the idea of identity politics. And I almost feel like your data might be backing up the idea of however people identify becomes where their political stance is coming from. Do you agree with that?
Very much so. I mean, we look at how people associate with different facets of their identity, racial identity, American identity, but we also ask about partisan and ideological identities. And on the progressive left, the identities of greatest pride there's two of them. One is being progressive. So that ideological orientation, the idea that society ought to bring a sense of fairness and equality to everybody. That identity, it's a moral identity. It's not just a kind of political thinking. It has a weight of morality that means that people are proud to have it. It's also an identity which people feel that they've selected on the progressive left. And so that's very much the way that progressives wake up in the morning, is thinking about themselves as such, as progressives. It's something which is at the forefront of their mind. And on the conservative side, they're similarly, their religious and American identities are prominent, and those two identities are very much at odds. And so you have this conflict between those who want to bring about change and those who want to preserve and even extend their American and traditional identities, their religious identities. And then on the progressive side, you also have a lot of emphasis around group categories, especially gender, race, and sexuality, which are seen, and this is maybe drawing a little bit from Marxist thinking, as group identities that sit in a hierarchy of power. And so the groups that have historically had the most power through this prism are white Americans and white male Americans and white male Christian Americans. And then the groups that are racial minorities, sexual minorities, gender minorities have been historically disadvantaged. And so the progressive lens is very much looking at society not as primarily as individuals making choices, but instead as people who belong to groups, and groups have power. And so we have these competing lenses on society that people are navigating politics through. And one of the most important questions to ask in understanding where someone sits on the political spectrum is, what identities are most important to you?
That makes a lot of sense. I've been on a personal unsuccessful mission to reclaim the concept of patriotism from the, I feel, sort of narrow place that it lives, and saying, part of being a good patriot is to protest injustice. So it's very liberal leaning, obviously, with that, progressive tint to it. But I always feel a sense of, I can be a patriot. I can say I want us to enact our ideals. I want us to fight the injustices we're furthering. And it's something that I think a lot of people on the left and liberal side, they, like you were saying, they skitter away from claiming themselves as patriots or Americans in that identity way. So that's an interesting distinction to make.
And so
that's right.
Yeah. Well,
go ahead, Eric.
I was going to say my next question actually kind of leads off of that. So you've looked at these other countries. How does the whole identity and the national identity factor into it compared to America?
Well, nationalism has a slightly different history in Europe. In Germany, nationalism is rather taboo. So for basically the second half of the 20th century and into the 21st century in Germany, it was taboo to fly the German flag. And talking about, so even in sports arenas, it didn't really emerge until Germany hosted the World Cup, which I think was around 2004, 2006. And so there is a real tension around talking about German national identity, German culture, the German people, because of the legacy of the Holocaust and the sensitivity that German people have towards the dangers associated with nationalism, which is the way that it's perceived there. That's slowly changing. And one of the big findings from my colleagues who led a study called Fault Lines, which was released last fall in Germany, was that now a majority of Germans, 60% of Germans, say that it's time to move on from that legacy and that we no longer need to continue to feel ashamed of being German. And so we're seeing that there's a resistance to continuing to feel kind of guilt associated with that German legacy. In France, the French national identity is actually quite a lot like what Aisala was talking about, where the French national identity is still associated with some of the features of the revolution, the French Revolution, around solidarity and protest against power. And so there's very much a deep relationship between protest and confronting power and what it is to be a French person. And then, and also another element about French national identity is quite different from American national identity is laïcité, which is this concept of secularism. It's not exactly secularism, but there's this notion of separation of church and state and separation of religious identity from the public space, which is obviously quite different from the way that American identity is conceived of. And then in the UK, it's a bit complicated. There's a desire to be distinct from Europe, especially on the conservative side. And there's simultaneously a lot of kind of new cosmopolitan identity, which is especially located in London. So London's a majority non-British born city, biggest city, of course, in the UK. And most people are not naturally from the UK. And so there's this tension between North and South in the UK, where the South is the more cosmopolitan, less nationally oriented, and the North tends to be more conservative and more associated with the British identity.
Yeah, I think identity, again, not just personal identity, as we were talking about, but I that's where I have the disconnect. I have a hard time thinking of myself as an American when I don't feel like what people define as traditional American values represent my values. I was having a conversation the other day with someone, and it came up, about the differences and why the polarization. And I said, as simple as this: I'm going to come down on the side of protecting lives during COVID-19. I'm going to come down, and that means wearing masks and lockdowns, and patriotism to me is, stay home and not further this thing any more than it has been. But then other sides of it, if I come down on the side that is, anti-hate and anti police brutality and things like that, I feel at least good about my ethical leanings. And I couldn't really explain why the other side clings so tenaciously to those thoughts. So it's hard to say I feel like a proud American when at least half of the country, give or take, doesn't apparently agree with what I consider to be basic ethics.
Yeah, I mean, we're seeing a lot of these tensions. We talk to 100 Americans on a daily basis. Actually, we have a community of Americans that kind of represent a cross-section of who we are, and we ask them, we've been asking them a lot about this tensions within American identity recently. And I mean, the COVID-19 tensions around abiding by social distancing measures it's an interesting flashpoint in some of the broader tensions that we see within the country, because one of the tensions we see is a decline in trust in experts and a decline in trust in science, which really correlates strongly with being politically conservative and supportive of Trump. And so we find that new things, which shouldn't have any connection to American identity or to politics, quickly become politicized because they're part of deep divisions, which end up becoming politicized.
Yeah. I talk about my dad a lot. He's a very conservative, religiously conservative person living in southern Utah. And I'm sort of on the other side of the line around all of that. And we're still really close. And that's one of the things that sort of I've appreciated about my relationship with him, is I can have these conversations with him around some of these topics. And for the most part, they go fairly well. Like, we don't agree politically, and it hasn't really been an issue. However, the last couple of times that I talked to him, it was a little bit more tense. And I realized that it was partially because he was expecting me to have a certain set of opinions, which he's never really been kind of in that space before. But he'd asked me a question, and then he sort of assumed that my response was going to be sort of the Democratic Party line. And I had to keep stopping him and say, you have to talk to me. I'm not a party. I'm a person, your daughter, sitting right here at your table. And and it worked. Like we got to it, but it was just really interesting to me to feel that shift where I had not experienced that with him, and to realize I think that's when I get into those situations with people where I feel like I'm not getting anywhere. I feel like it's generally because one or both of us is not actually talking to the person in front of us. We're talking to our perception of their party or their religion or whatever else. And so we're not actually hearing them. We're hearing the things that support our prejudice, or they're hearing that from me, as I experienced with my dad.
Yeah. Yeah. So 2 thoughts on that. And one is that generational difference is something that we see all the time in our research, because let's say over the age of 60, you grew up in a different world, in a different United States, where democracy was still rather rare, where your adulthood was defined by an opposition from the Soviet Union, which was an atheist communist country with repression and no freedoms of speech and no political competition and harsh poverty. And the Soviet Union was the threat. It was a threatening power which could have dominated the rest of the world. I mean, really had the ambitions of converting the rest of the world to communism. And that external enemy was something which I think really helped fortify a sense of American identity in the second half of the 20th century, when so many Americans were divided on other issues, but like, at least we're not the Soviet Union, right?
Yeah.
And our generation comes to age in the 90s and the 2000s. The United States has been sort of at the top of the political universe and has not had that external enemy of any real variety. And so I think that there's just that significant cultural difference. And then to your second point about the perception, I have experienced the same thing in my own family, also talking to my parents. And I think it echoes a lot of what we saw in the perception gap study, which you mentioned earlier, where we know that people who are more politically engaged tend to have more of a caricatured perception of what the average Democrat or what the average Republican thinks. And it's a real problem, which it's difficult to disentangle the causal relationships, why exactly this happens. But we know that the more news you consume, the more likely it is that you're going to overestimate how different your political opponents are from you. And in particular, what's happening with social media is that we know that the algorithms of social media are designed in order to optimize for outrage. And what generates outrage is shareable. And the more shareable things are, the more time people spend on the social media platforms. And that's the more revenue that's generated for the social media platforms. And so what ends up happening are the news stories that are most outrageous, whether it's about conservatives or whether it's about progressives doing something that's really upsetting to the other side, those are the ones that get a lot of traction. And it ends up coloring our perception of what our political opponents are like in a way that is caricatured. And so people like your father, it was representative of a group of more politically active conservatives who have a distorted view of progressives, and the same is true from the other side.
You just blew my mind, because I think you just summarized something I couldn't put my finger on about why I hate social media. And I think you just nailed it. They optimize for the things that'll be controversial, generate outrage, and generate clicks and likes and all of that. And I really hadn't thought about it that way. I just thought it was kind of a broken system, but my mind is kind of blown right now.
It's intentionally set up that way. Are you familiar with, Stephen? We did a show with a woman called Vanessa Otero. She created the media bias chart through Adfontes Media. And her view on this is, I think, really wise, is to say that, like, we used to have news was editorialized and by journalists, and now it's just everywhere. And she said, we saw the same thing happen with food. Food used to be food, and then it was processed and maybe didn't have nutrients. And so rather than trying to go back or something, let's start labeling our news. And let's have and so she created sort of almost like a news consumption chart. Like at the top middle is news. It's objectively reported facts. That's it. And there's 3 sources. And then you go down a little bit and it's like CNN and Fox and MSNBC. And she's like, it's analysis with some news. And you just keep going down. And she's like, and basically you don't, there's things like Twitter. They're like candy. You don't eat that for food. That's a occasionally thing. And with social media, it's a really interesting, the first one she did herself. And then it was so well responded to that she got funding to recruit people from across the political spectrum, and then they go in and they review different news sources and programs. And so you can look at this chart, and her goal is to someday be able to actually label news sources so you can look and see this is actual news or it's mostly opinion or whatever. I don't know. I think that would be helpful because I don't think we can get rid of the spectrum of bad information, but maybe we could help people be more aware of what they're consuming. I was curious if you think that would be helpful or not, given that you know way more about what people are dealing with.
Well, I really like the metaphor. In fact, we've talked about a news media diet and having a balanced diet a number of times. I hadn't heard that specifically from Vanessa, but I'm aware of some of her work. And it is a good analogy, I think, because in the 1960s, 70s, for instance, we really only had a few options for broadcast news and a few options for your newspaper. The news was measured on the basis of being balanced and neutral, because if you were skewed to one way or the other, you'd lose half of your audience, because half your audience is Democrat, half of it's Republican. So you necessarily had to prepare a balanced meal. And now in an environment where, as you said, there's this proliferation of news sources and media sources, and we're fighting constantly in an attention economy where you could either read the news or play Candy Crush or watch YouTube. And there's not this kind of designated segment of your day where you watch that evening news, but instead it's always fighting for your attention. The news media have a different set of incentives. And they have found that affirming people's identities is a great way to preserve an audience. And outrage is a great way to make your news shareable. And it holds people's attention more than good news does. And so between those two things, affirming people's identity and generating outrage, we have a new incentive structure relative to the past where it was, let's show a balanced news source or balanced news picture. And it's worrying. And when you combine that with the social media incentives, it means that we don't have an alignment between what's best for society and what's best for the news media. And that requires some kind of systemic intervention. Yeah.
She's local to us here in Denver, by the way. I was very surprised to find that out as well.
Yeah, she's like in Westminster.
Yeah. When we approached her the same way we kind of approached you once we figured out who she was, and we're surprised. There seems to be some good thought happening here in Colorado. I'm happy about that. Just to broaden things about your organization a little bit, I realize it's probably, primarily for gathering data and fact checking and all of that. Is there plans? What is More in Common doing to kind of maybe further some of this and actually fight it?
Well, there are two main initiatives that we're pursuing in 2020. One of them we're calling the Election Integrity Project, and it's related to navigating the 2020 election, which is going to be, we anticipate, the most turbulent presidential election maybe in a century. And the reason for that is that we have a president who has just in the past week said that he won't necessarily accept the outcome of the election. And we also know that there's going to be an enormous amount of uncertainty around the election because of the way that people are casting votes by mail. It's likely that we won't have an answer, not on election night, but we might not even have an answer to who won the election for a week or more after the election. And so that's just going to create a lot of anxiety and tension. And it's likely there will be lawsuits against states where the disputing the methods of counting and how long should we count for, and what about these things, votes that arrived on the November 4th, et cetera. And so the potential for irregularities is very high. The potential for disputed election is very high. And the consequences of this election to Americans feel very grave. So it's very typical in polls to ask, of course, what's the top issue that you think the government should be handling? For a long time, it's been healthcare on the left, immigration on the right. Right now, 32% of Americans, so tied for first place, is ensuring a safe and secure elections, right at the top of people's minds right now. And so, and part of that is because of the consequences of America being very nervous about either losing the country to a socialist agenda or another 4 years of Donald Trump and his scandals. And so we're very nervous as an organization, and our network of organizations that work on problems of polarization and democracy are very nervous about what November is going to be like. And so the project that we're working on is trying to understand how can we navigate those fraught few weeks in November well by positioning people who have relationships of trust with large sections of the public and empower them with the best information about what's happening, to reassure people that the results are being counted and the process is being undertaken fairly, and to basically try and preserve the confidence of the American people in the outcome of the election. So that's the Election Integrity Project. And the other project, which I'll be more succinct about, is something called American Fabric. And with this, we are trying to look at some of these questions, which you've already been speaking about today, about how we can cultivate a sense of shared national identity. How is it that Aisela can see her dad or see some of her dad's generation and their conservative beliefs in Utah and feel a sense of connection that at the end of the day, we're all Americans, and that has some meaning to it, that there's some connection within that American identity that's actually important and that actually is something that we take, that we value. And to create that, I think we're going to need to have a conversation that breaks out of seeing American identity either as something which is chest beating and rah-rah, and something which is also not just self-flagellation and self-loathing, but instead something which wrestles with the complexity of our past, while being honest about the things that we can be proud of and that we should try to celebrate about our identity. Yeah. So between those two projects, we've got our hands full.
Yeah. Well, and you just made me realize that I think one of the reasons my dad and I have stayed so close is I know we share the same values, and ultimately being family has always mattered more. That's the identity that is our priority in our relationship. And so it rarely gets overwhelmed by anything else. And we still speak our minds. And thank you for that segue. I'm excited to share with our listeners that we are already planning to have Stephen come back and talk about these projects. And I would love to do it before the election. I think we talked maybe September, so people can have that information for as they go forward.
Looking forward to it.
Yeah, I think it'll be great. I really am looking forward to you. Offline, we talked, you have some data that you just got in and it's going to take some time to go through, but I would be very excited to go over that, especially as it relates to and before the election. So, well, thank you so much. Yeah, thank you so much for being on. We really appreciate it. Like I said, I don't think I've had a guest that I've talked to that feels more of a kindred spirit in the part of the reason I got into doing this personally. So keep up the good work, and we would love to have you back.
And
thanks so much. Oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead. I'm going to read a thing.
Well, just thank you for the invitation, and it's exciting to find people of common orientation here in Denver, and I appreciate you giving us the opportunity to talk a little bit about our organization and the work we're doing.
Yeah, we'll post any links that are relevant, anything you'd like to share, things we talked about on the show. But yeah, we'll definitely get that up with this show as well. So it'll be a good opportunity for our listeners and folks interested in your organization to kind of hear some of the details. I love it. So
thanks for listening. If you have ideas, feedback, thoughts, please find us on social media. We are BiCurean on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, or give us a call at 303-578-9155 or email podcast@BiCurean.com.
And if you like what we're doing, please rate us on your listening platform of choice.
Thank you.